Friends, welcome to the Resilience YMCA Leaders Talk. This is the 5th event of the series, and we are honored to have today very distinguished speakers with us. I'd like you to know that Spanish and Japanese translation is available in the subtitle. And I'd also like to welcome everyone around the world watching this live stream on Facebook. We will change the procedure a little bit today. And I would like to first introduce Amina J. Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, and Patricia Pelton, President of the World YMCA.
You can mute from here, okay?
We would like to invite participants to ask questions using the Q&A function. Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, Barka Desua.
Barka Mude. How are you? Ramadan Kareem to all those who are participating in the fasting. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. We have the tradition to ask our all speakers about how are you taking care of your body, mind, spirit. And after that, I hand over to my president, Patricia, to start the conversation with you.
Okay. Are you asking me about how I'm taking care of oh my goodness me. Well, I think we've for us in the United Nations, we started with a business continuity plan, which put us straight back in our homes. And so a lot of the support has been in that new way of working, how to keep people engaged, how to ensure that we're reaching out and taking care of their well-being, the check-ins, the things we didn't imagine before were a challenge at home in a very small workspace, managing your family, managing time, because time now just has no boundaries, it keeps going. And all of that, just taking into those considerations and really basically keeping in touch with our people around the world, from New York to the furthest points in our over 130 countries that we are today. But mostly it's just keeping in contact, it's listening, it's giving support, and it's getting on with the job, because that's really what we are doing. We're on the front lines in many places and we're trying to support others.
Thanks so much, and it's just a real pleasure to meet you, Deputy Secretary General. I'm going to just plunge right into the questions because I know you have limited time, and thank you again for joining us. So my first question for you today is, how is the United Nations responding to the COVID-19 crisis, and how can Sustainable Development Goals help, or will they help, accelerate recovery? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Patricia, it's lovely to join you, and thank you for having me. Well, I mean, this has been very complex. It's unprecedented in its challenge. COVID appears as a health emergency, but very quickly we know that it's actually a global crisis with human dimensions that we have not seen since World War II. And in a lot of ways, the prescriptions that we put for the COVID health have these side effects on the socioeconomic side. So very quickly, putting many people in developing countries in a position where they may be having to choose between their health and a livelihood, because that's actually a daily meal, and that's very difficult. So what the UN is doing is, first of all, putting out there that we have 3 emergencies. We have a health emergency, we have a humanitarian one, and we have a socioeconomic one. Putting them together to say there shouldn't be choices. The global response should be to everyone, everywhere. And we underscore that if you've got COVID in any part of the world, then everyone is at risk. And so it's really important that we deal with this at the same time. And we say, for want of a better word, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So if you've got stimulus packages that you can supply, you can find the liquidity to support in the North, then we must also help developing countries, emerging markets do the same. We are, with the health response, you see the WHO on the front lines providing the testing, the tracing, the capabilities, the training of staff, and making sure that people everywhere are safe. The humanitarian space exists in many places of conflict. But you'll see that the SG has also called for sanctions to be lifted and for ceasefire. We have one case where it's just a work in progress right now. We hope we can get to the conclusions in Yemen of a peaceful future, because they are suffering in ways that are unimaginable. And then we have the socioeconomic response, in which we are working with governments on the debt issue. And we're also looking to see that fiscal space can be created to ensure we, first of all, strengthen health systems. And secondly, we look to see how to keep livelihoods going, people in jobs, community resilience and engagement, young people engaged in this. And then just to say that COVID might have put a pause on the world for many things, but it didn't put one on climate change, it didn't put one on inequalities or poverty. And so it's really important that while we address the emergency response to COVID, that we keep the SDGs alive, we keep the climate agenda alive, and we use those as deepening the opportunities to build back better. And so where, for example, where we would have had perhaps taken a lot longer to get a social protection program up and cash transfers, now it is an emergency. Now we have to go at scale. And in doing that, we can probably leapfrog a number of areas in many countries that we wouldn't have had the opportunity. Same for connectivity. We want kids to continue learning. So can they do it online at home? That means connectivity. And can we do that at scale now? Is there the fiscal space for that? Water and sanitation. Many things that we can do in parallel. And so we shouldn't put a pause on the frameworks and the agendas that we have. We should try to make sure that we use them to strengthen the response and the Build Back Better.
Thanks very much. And truly, necessity is the mother of invention. And so we have seen acceleration of digitalization, of learning through digitalization and so many other ways. And it's really important to keep those SDGs top of mind. Yeah, thank you. Next question. How is the United Nations addressing the needs of young people now? And are you preparing to support young people in the new normal in terms of mental health, economic opportunity, and the climate emergency?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that we've seen incredible leadership from young people. So it's not just helping them. I think what it is supporting them and traveling in this journey together, not leaving them behind and waiting till we finish with it and then we come back and say, let's have young people. No, they're actually in leadership roles in the UN, forging ahead with many of the innovations that we see put on the front line. For instance, with the Solidarity Fund, a lot of that has been put together by young people and innovators to get innovative ways of leveraging resources for the WHO and for the frontline workers with what we do. It was a number of young people that came together with Global Citizen so that we can come into people's homes and connect with this crisis that has so dislocated, society from one another. But it is also a very stressful time. And here it is many young people worrying about their jobs, many worrying about the future. We will not come out of COVID the same again. So to help engage young people in shaping what that should look like going forward, and perhaps creating that space and convening it for making that happen. On the issue of mental health, this of course is a huge scourge that is growing. Just as we saw gender-based violence, there are a number of abuses in the home that are happening, but I think most of all, when we address mental health with young people, we will be issuing, the SG is issuing a policy paper next week, which takes into account different ways that we need to address this. More importantly, putting together all the tools that are available and helping people connect with people with and with the tools that will help them both at home and afterwards. Many young people on the front line are health workers that are heroes. And I think we sometimes forget many of them are young and being exposed to, one crisis after the other, which right now they are, up there dealing with and they don't even give it a second thought. But the day after the crisis is over, we will need to be there to make sure that we have the support to bring people back together in society and working. So it is uppermost in our minds. I think what we are doing is trying to find better ways to convene and to connect with groups like this. So this is very important. I'm looking forward to all the outcomes from this discussion. So we feed it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm hoping that I'm still connected. Can you hear me, Amina?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. I just got a little blurb. So thanks very much. We're really looking forward to that policy paper coming out. I think that will be also very helpful to us in working together. I have another question for you. How do you see the role of civil society and youth organizations like the YMCA evolving to provide support and services to the most vulnerable? And how can YMCAs partner with the United Nations to ensure no one is left behind?
Thank you. That's a really good question, because we are now working in an environment where it is essential workers that are out there, because we're trying to minimize the spread of the virus, and so trying to suppress the virus. And that therefore means in many, many cases across countries, we are all working from home online. So I think there are many opportunities across countries, depending on their priorities, to address this and to be very specific and to try to make sure that we harness the YMCA and its other partners in NGOs, civil society, community-based organizations as partners. For us, the place to connect would be with our UN country teams. We have these in 131 countries. That's a pretty good start. And to connect with them, because they will be dealing with how we leverage the resources for the community work that we need to do. Community engagement, keeping people indoors, away from livelihoods, requires us to be very creative in how we keep both the economy going and people safe. And I think here, any sort of innovation hubs that we can have with those problems put to a group of young people to find the solutions to, is what the UN would really love to see. We're already doing this in a couple of countries where this has been very good in ways and means of connecting on education. It's also been so in how we create wash stations for hand washing in many communities, because it's not just slums that we see people in densely populated environments. It's also in the way we live in many of the compounds that we have across many of our regions, from Asia to Latin America and Africa. And we have to find ways of getting to them with a livelihood, but at the same time, trying to break this transmission. And so I would say that the place to start is with the country teams who have a number of agencies within them, and a resident coordinator who can convene and bring these spaces together in many, many places with many contexts.
Thank you. That will be very helpful for us. And you know, I've heard the term societal PTSD post-pandemic, and I think it really rings true, particularly with young people and their mental health. So we will all have to be prepared for that. And then this whole business of tension between the economy and safety, and reopening the economy, but while keeping people safe, it's a challenge. It's a challenge everywhere.
Well, we're in uncharted territory, and this is why we need to be humble enough to know that we may not have the answers, and that we can have them if we can sit to co-create. I think, this is a time for very deep reflection. This has happened to everybody everywhere, and it has, we've seen inequality in the North and inequality in developing countries. While there is a huge health emergency in developed countries that have also been unable to cope and suddenly realize that many of their health systems have not responded to the elderly, for instance. While we are preparing for that in developing countries, we see that, in fact, the socioeconomic side effects have reached us before the pandemic has made landfall in the way it has done so here. So we hope, and we don't know the answers to it, we hope it won't be as harsh as it has been in developed countries. But what is very clear is that in the coming months and years, many of the gains that we have had in our economies, in emerging markets and developing countries will be lost. And so we need a concerted effort to try to stop that slide by making sure that whatever we put down now can help us recover better. Now, we're having a huge conversation with the finance sector in the world today. And while there has been some welcome support to our least developed countries, it's not sufficient, because vulnerability today is not just about a manner in which you determine growth. It is about the vulnerability that COVID has caused in every society and what it has done to economies. That those who are relying on tourism, those whose supply chains have been broken now, and that we're looking for a farming season and we cannot get those supplies to them, nor can they go out to farm. I mean, these are very serious issues in the economy that will take a long time to recover from. I think communicating and articulating what they are, so that this huge wealth of leadership and I would say capacities from our youth to engage with them is going to be important. So start thinking about the day after right now,
Yes.
And engaging with that. But we need to be explicit about it. Otherwise, it's overwhelming. Somebody says to you, what are the big issues? And then you put a Christmas tree in front of them with so many things on it, they can't see the woods for the trees. We need to be very specific about what those issues are, and then to gather with young people, because this is their future. The day after COVID, they will be leading, it will be their jobs, they will be shaping, we hope, a much better world. We hope people will take this time to really reflect about the needs and the quality of our life, and not the wants and what we have done in the imbalance between our humanity and our environment that has created this.
Thank you so much. Such fulsome answers. Really very much appreciated. Carlos, do we have any questions from our participants?
Yes, Madam President, there's a lot of questions for the Deputy Secretary General. The first on the top of my screen here is from Joan Donnelly. He says, how do we best capitalize on the climate gains seen in the last 8 to 12 weeks just by function of shutdown and not from policy?
Well, that's a great question. And one of the things that happened at the Petersburg dialogues that happened on climate was to see how much engagement that there is in us really trying to say, as we grow back better, one of the things that we see is an opportunity where loans are being taken and will have to be renegotiated after COVID. How can we look at some of the conditions that we can put there for it? So that when you're getting an extension to pay back many loans, can we then say, well, okay, we need to see more expenditure here. This is what we need to see you do in ways that can grow back better. Many opportunities with many of the energy transitions. People have to be kept with power, and so that power, if it's not happening with fossil fuels, we can certainly see that the investments could be made in solar power and extending that. And on climate, I would say that we're already seeing countries who are removing fossil fuel subsidies. What we have to do is to make sure that they stay off, and that we continue to invest, find better ways to kick revenues into the economy that are greener, and that it shows greener jobs. So I think the same climate action agenda that we had planned from the summit last year, all the coalitions work that we have is still valid today, and we shouldn't stop pushing that. And I think now is the time to push ahead with it, so that we are in that, we change the narrative, we change the investment response by many as we come through COVID. I think we have to remember that businesses really are informed by their shareholders, and this is a really important time to start advocating and communicating to shareholders that they demand different things are done with their money.
How can and will the UN help to make sure that civil society organizations like YMCAs will survive the financial burden coming out of the pandemic?
Well, I think this is to make sure that when we are looking at the stimulus packages and we are targeting community resilience and engagement, a great part of that has got to do with groups like the YMCA, and we have to make sure they're involved. First, we have to make sure that we understand what it is they're challenged by so that we know what to do to mitigate that. And so for me, I think the decision-making right now, when you are getting debt relief in a country, we have to start asking the questions of government. So the debt relief for what? If we want a debt standstill for 2 years, what will be those priorities, and how can we make sure that those that deliver services at the lowest level where the most vulnerable are also protected to be able to continue to do their jobs? And that's why this is one of the 5 points in our in what we're doing in the UN response to COVID on the socioeconomic side, is putting a lot of pressure around ensuring that the community engagement and resilience is seen.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time, Madam President. I think according to our agreement, we should let the Deputy Secretary General move to our next function. But may I give you the space for thanking her?
I thank you very much, Carlos. And Deputy Secretary General, again, well, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've got a meeting, I believe, now with the African Union. And so, you know, from one to another, we're so appreciative of your time and your wise counsel. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Very, very pleased to have been able to join you. Please send me the other questions I've not been able to answer. My next meeting was with 14 amazing ministers of foreign affairs in Africa that are all women. And so that for us is really fantastic and an inspiration to me, so I imagine to many others as well. And as we say, women are rising to the challenge. We're not just carrying the burdens, we're also leading where those in power have not been able to do so as well. So, you know, from carrying the burden to leading the way out of this crisis, women at the forefront. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Patricia, for this moment is so important for us. I'd like to invite you now to share the highlight from last week's Leaders Talk.
But I've also seen over the past 8 weeks remarkable positivity and things out of this crisis that give me huge hope as a citizen and as a leader at CARE, at the Y, from my neighbors, from our communities, and from our governments. I've seen agility, decisiveness, innovation, empathy, and collaboration.
I mean, this is probably the first time in history that the entire world is trying to solve one problem together. And we're figuring it out in real time. I don't think that we're going to know for a while. What we do know, though, is that the decisions that we make now are going to affect us in the long term. And we believe that the next pandemic that is coming will be in the mental health space. That 90% of youth value their mental health, yet really only a third of them know where to go for resources. So we are finding that gap with youth and working with them to identify those resources where they can go not only for their own assistance, mental health support, but perhaps volunteer as well in their communities. We are also conducting research on how this pandemic is affecting youth so that we can address that moving forward.
It's just communicating relentlessly to all your stakeholders, internally and externally. Don't go silent with your donors. There's a lot of anxiety and concern among your team. You can be very honest, but just be in regular touch about what you are doing, what we can control, the things we can choose, and how we are responding and the actions we are taking. I found it helpful to think about this the way, and I know many of you have faced natural disasters or man-made disasters around the world. There's a relief phase and then the recovery phase. And we're in the long emergency relief phase. But for those of us who aren't direct frontline healthcare workers, it's really important to remind people of the recovery, because in a typical disaster, 80% of the resources go to the relief effort, and then there's not enough for that long rebuild and recovery. And we desperately need the capacity of the Ys and the other nonprofits in the recovery phase as we try to build our way back in our global economy.
We need to start thinking more globally. You know, this is a pandemic, and that means that we're only as strong as the weakest parts of our society globally. And so, you know, thinking in those terms, we ought to be thinking, well, what happens when the numbers start to tick up significantly in parts of the world that really don't have the resources we do, or the health systems we do, where food security, as Jonathan and Barbara talked about, become a bigger issue, as you mentioned, Carlos. What do we do in those cases? And sadly, I think there's a lack of leadership today. And I'm hopeful YMCA can help to provide some of that leadership, because you're an institution that's been around a very long time and has a very strong mission and voice. And you reach so many people around the world. And I think being able to lift that up and say, you know, this is a moment we need to think about the least among us. We need to think about the most vulnerable parts of society and to think big. This is a chance to do that. So
we will partner with those who share our values, and we will partner with people who want to make a difference and who don't have a lot of organizational ego, because people have needs. Organizations do not have needs. The job of organizations is to meet the needs of people.
Now it's my privilege to welcome our next speaker, Leslie Johnston. Leslie is the CEO of the Laudes Foundation. Laudes Foundation is responding to the dual crisis of inequality and climate change by supporting brave, innovative efforts that inspire and challenge industry to harness its power for good. Leslie, good to see you again.
Thank you.
How are you taking care of your body, mind, and spirit during this crisis?
Oh my goodness, not as well as I'd like to. Trying to keep running, feed my kids healthy food, and take time to reflect, because we are in the great pause, as I've heard it's called, and we should not squander this opportunity. But I could do more in that space. Great. Well, thank you, Carlos. Yes, and I'm going to share a few slides, so just bear with me while I open those up. One moment. And let's see. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor. And what I'd like to do is share a little bit the perspective of philanthropy in this crisis. Because I think that's a perspective that maybe has not yet been shared as part of the Resilient Leaders Talks. It's a very important sector in this crisis. Of course, I run a foundation called Laudes Foundation, which is based in Europe. And I'd like to share a little bit about what we're doing as a foundation in this crisis, but then more broadly, some of the trends that we're seeing in philanthropy and the role of philanthropy in the crisis. And I think, as the Deputy Secretary General had rightly said, we are indeed in crisis, but there's more coming. And it's not time to, well, essentially put a pause on the work that's already underway, put a pause on the SDGs, because of course we have the climate crisis, we have deepening inequality, we have, you know, reduction or elimination of biodiversity. There is a real whirlwind of challenges that are not too far away. So now is a time, I think, for us to pause and think about what can we do now to make us better and more resilient to handle these bigger challenges that are coming our way. And we are very inspired by the words of Kofi Annan over 20 years ago, when he called for a better system. And the way he said it, I think, is very eloquent. And I'd like to just bring that back as a starting point, is that we need to choose between a global market driven only by calculations of short-term profit and one that has a human face. And I think now with this challenge that we're seeing with COVID-19, we're seeing the effects of a system that has prioritized profit over people and nature. And that's not sustainable, and it's not something that's going to carry us through to where we want to go. Because if you look at the data, it's frightening. We are indeed in a climate crisis. I'm sure many of you have seen this graph, which shows the annual average global temperatures over time from 1850 through to 2018. And the red tells its own story. But then also the deepening acceleration of inequality that we're seeing globally is frightening. And that's being perpetuated by the system that we're all operating under. So what can we do about that? And how do we react, especially given the challenging context that we're in right now? And I do want to say first a caveat in that philanthropy is not going to save the world. In fact, philanthropy in its best form can be a catalyst to try to accelerate the work of civil society, of the private sector, of government to address these challenges. If you look at climate as an example, total funding that philanthropy is putting into climate is, well, until Jeff Bezos made his announcement, was only about $1 billion. But the total investment on the public sector side is over 170 billion. Total investment on the private sector side is over 265 billion. So is philanthropy going to solve climate? No, but it can actually play, I think, a critical role in trying to change the system. So let me share a little bit of information on Laudes Foundation, because we are the new kid on the block. We just launched in January, and our vision as a foundation is to work toward a global market that can value all people and respect nature. We're inspired by Kofi Annan's words, and we think that there is a different system and a different future for the world that we want to have. And our mission as a foundation is to support that brave action that can both inspire and challenge industry to harness its power for good. Because we believe that industry can be a powerful lever for change, but sometimes it needs incentives, it needs parameters, it needs a little bit of a nudge to make that happen. So that's what we stand for. And just very quickly, our approach as a foundation is really twofold. On the one hand, we're working through industries. So we're working right now in the fashion industry and also in the built environment. But on the other hand, we're working through finance, specifically capital markets. And we believe if you can influence the flow of capital in the system, you can change behavior of the various actors in the system. And our overall goal as a foundation is very big. By 2030, we want to build and contribute to building an inclusive economy where essentially mindsets, rules, and powers have shifted so that business and markets not only mitigate climate change, but also eliminate inequality. So that was our big ambition. This is what we communicated about 5 months ago when we first came out. And then, of course, in February and March, the crisis hit. And for me, the COVID-19 crisis effectively laid bare the inequalities of this global system, the system that has created so much opportunity and wealth, but also so much disparity and inequality, and the system that effectively has been perpetuating the climate crisis that, to be honest, we have 10 years to address. And I really deeply believe that now is a chance for us to rebuild the system together and so that it can be more just. So this is an opportunity. Now, as a foundation, how did we respond when this crisis hit? First and foremost, we wanted to ensure that all of our staff are healthy and safe. And that is no small order. We have 60 staff members across the world, and that was our first priority. But secondly, our priority was to our partners and to make sure that they're more resilient to the shocks that are coming and that will continue to come. And I'll talk a little bit about that in more detail. And of course, business continuity. That's very important for a foundation because of the shock. The reduction in endowments due to the market changes has led many foundations to either pull back a bit, to cancel commitments they've made, or maybe even stop funding what they had already committed to. And for us, it was very important that we not only respect our contracts, but also continue working under our current budget so that partners have that certainty. So I'll talk a little bit about our partner approach, because our partners are really mostly based in Asia and Latin America, and we have a few partners in Southern Africa. And essentially our approach to partners was both financial and non-financial. And I think on the non-financial, I'll start with that first, it was important for us to show solidarity. A lot of our partners are grassroots organizations. A lot of them are, dependent on our funding, and we reached out early March as soon as we knew that this was going to impact them. But more importantly, we started to offer flexibility. As a funder, unfortunately, the funder-partner relationship is one of a power imbalance. So we immediately started discussing how can we relax deadlines, how can we convert our programmatic grants to more general operating support. We also wanted our partners to strengthen their own resilience. So we have quite a bit of non-financial support in terms of consultants and information to help them develop their own crises plans, to strengthen their organizations and make sure that they're resilient to future shocks. And then last but not least, we created an emergency fund. This launched about 3 weeks ago, and we essentially, in consultation with our partners, worked with them to determine where they need funding, and how can we get it to them very quickly. We relaxed all of our usual requirements, and within 3 weeks, we're able to design, implement, launch, run, fund, and close an emergency fund, which was thanks to my colleagues all over the world in being very flexible. Now, what was surprising about this, first of all, the outpouring of gratitude from our partners, I think, was really heartwarming, and not all foundations were acting this way. So I think if I could urge, if there's any funders on the line, it's good to offer money to your partners for unexpected costs. But that is certainly one approach that we think has given immediate relief. But what surprised me was the following, is that the majority of the funding wasn't actually kept by the partners. It was actually passed through. And it was passed through because these partners are working with vulnerable communities and populations, whether it's garment workers in Bangladesh or migrant farmers in India or immigrants in Brazil coming in from Bolivia. 67% of the funding was actually given to partners, beneficiaries in the form of food on the table or even PPE. So we're really talking about emergency direct relief. 23% of it went to the working capital of the partners, which is how we expected it to go. And almost half of our funding went to India, where the need is great. I saw there's quite a few people from India on the line, and it's very concerning what's happening. And for me, the funding itself for each partner who received funding was only about 7% of the total of our grant to that partner. So it wasn't a huge amount, but the fact that we gave it quickly and actually with very little, if any, restrictions was very helpful in this time. But philanthropy overall, I think, has a bigger role to play in this crisis. And I think what's really positive about the philanthropic sector is that you're seeing a tremendous amount of collaboration around the need to react. And you may be aware of this. The Council on Foundations in the US launched a philanthropy pledge in partnership with Ford Foundation and other leading foundations, which as of, well, yesterday had 744 signatories. It's probably going up because it's ticking up every day. And for me, this pledge, which we have signed, has offered 8 promises. And I think if there's a call to action to any funders or friends of funders that are on the line, every foundation should sign up for this, because what these 8 promises say is that we as funders pledge to not only loosen or even eliminate restrictions on grants, but also make more grants as unrestricted as possible. We pledge to reduce our asks of our nonprofit partners. This is critical. We have 50,000 cotton farmers that we're supporting. We have a lot of data from the last season that I would love to see, but it's impossible to collect that data. So we are not in a position to ask our partners to go out and put themselves at risk to collect that data. So reduce our asks, but then also contribute financially to community-based emergency responses. And community here is critical. I mean, many of you on the line are leaders in your communities, and we find that getting money to communities, to community leaders, is the most effective way to get it where it needs to go. We pledge to communicate regularly and proactively and to listen to our partners. But number 7, and to me this is key, support grantee partners advocating for public policy changes. Now, the Deputy Secretary General referred to this. There's an opportunity now to rewrite the system, the policies, the enabling environment under which we're operating. And now is a chance to get in there. And ultimately, we want to learn. We want to learn from this emergency response, which, to be honest, is being done very quickly. You know, we're really reacting as opposed to thinking for several months on how to do this, and share with others what has made it effective. So that's what we're seeing. And of course, we will continue to see more foundations doing this. And we're also seeing that there are increasingly a large number of resources available for those responding to COVID-19. And I share a couple examples here. Of course, this presentation will be available for all, but of course the Council of Foundations has a lot of resources for funders and resources to help funders respond in a thoughtful way. The European Foundation Center has a list of resources publicly available on their website, and that actually shows a breakdown of what each of the members of EFC are doing in terms of the funding and the trends that they're taking. We're also seeing increased help for nonprofits during this time. And I put a link here that has a breakdown of the different relief and support programs that are launching. The other thing that I'm seeing a lot of is there's an increased number of challenges and funds. Of course, everyone loves a hackathon, so I think that this crisis has led to a lot of innovation and new thinking and funding for new ideas. So there's quite a bit of that. But there's also a lot of interesting awards for young people. Last week, I just talked to the founder of the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Award, which looks for young people 18 to 30 who are leaders in their community. And that's an award that's open now. Of course, we heard about the new fund that Ford Foundation launched a couple weeks ago called the Families and Workers Fund, which is really geared toward supporting families and communities. The European Youth Foundation is running a special call for pilot activities, again, trying to get innovation. And we're seeing a lot of enterprise relief funds, especially for small and medium-sized businesses. And I gave the example here of what we see in the UK. So there's a lot out there, and I imagine that it will only continue to grow. But for us as a relatively new foundation, I do have a specific call to action, both for philanthropy and for each of us as individuals. And I think for philanthropy, now is the time. This is actually a time of opening of minds when we're seeing with this crisis that there is space now in the public sector space to influence the policies that are being drafted, whether it's bailout policies or stimulus packages. If these can be drafted in such a way that are inclusive, that are addressing this deepening inequality, that are looking for green incentives for business and industry, then we will have not only protected ourselves from this immediate crisis, but hopefully made ourselves more resilient for the crisis that will come. But as individuals, we also have a role to play. And I think I opened with this, that this is a time for all of us to pause and reflect on what is our role? What does this mean for us? What does this mean for our own actions? Do we really need to travel as much as we do? Do we really need to buy single-use plastic? I mean, I know that's a small example, but with 7.5 billion people in the world, that really adds up. So I think that it does show that there is a role for personal responsibility. There is also a role for more proactive activism, reaching out to companies that you love and your brands and retailers and asking them, how are they reacting to this crisis? Are they taking care of their employees or employees in the supply chains. You know, we as consumers have an important role to play. We can support movements and coalitions. If there's a way to bring the movement that was emerging around climate together with this and start a movement around a new economy, you know, what does that new future look like for us? That's something I think could be very compelling and something we should all participate in. And finally, if you live in a country that has a fairly, you know, well-functioning government, it's always helpful to push policymakers and influencers to change policy and change it so that it works for the people it supports and it respects nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for this detailed presentation. I'm sure we're going to have a copy of it. So we're going to ask you just one question, then we will come back to question and answer after our third speaker. The question is, how do you see the change in this philanthropic industry post-COVID? What will be the fundamental shift in that industry after the COVID?
That's a very good question. And I wish I knew the answer, but I'll tell you my opinion, which is, I think there's a couple things we're going to see. I think we are going to see philanthropic funding, on the one hand, being hit hard. If market movements continue as they have, that means endowments are reducing, and that may mean foundations may pull back a bit. And already we're seeing that. One reason why some of our partners appreciated our emergency funding is because they lost funding from some of their other foundations for that reason. So I could see that being pulled back. And that's why I think it's really important as policy is being written that those incentives are still there for philanthropic giving. Because once those start getting stripped away, then we see what happens. So that's one thing. But I think that also means there's an opportunity. And there is a movement of foundations. It's really being led by Wallace Global and others to really look at how do you, given the fact that we have 10 years to address the climate crisis, how do you double down on climate? You know, in foundations of any organization, a foundation should be able to take that risk and increase its spending. So there is an opportunity for foundations to actually start spending down their endowments. It's something that we're seeing already, and there are commitments out there. And if more and more foundations do that, then that will be an injection of capital into the system to solve this very urgent crisis we're in.
Thank you, Leslie. So we'll give you some time to take back your breath, and when I'll introduce our next speaker, and we'll come back to another series of question and answer.
Thank you.
This is my real pleasure now to introduce you to Otto Scharmer, my good friend Otto. He is a senior lecturer in the MIT Management Sloan School and co-founder of the Presidency Institute. And he's the author of the book, Leading from the Emerging Future. Otto, you know, we discussed this several times before. Well, before you tell us about what you are doing, what is your insight and how we can lead from the emerging future, can you tell us how you are taking care of your body, mind, and spirit during this crisis?
Thank you very much. Hello, Carlos. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me on and join this conversation. So how do I take care of my body, mind, and spirit? Well, I think not traveling helps, right? Already quite a bit. Mm-hmm. I think I'm benefiting a lot of essential workers so that I can stay at home, you know, and probably eat a little more healthy than I would do during travels. Out in nature, long walks, mindfulness practices. So in building that, you know, having that a regular daily routine. That helps me, but then I also liked what Amina said, kind of getting on with the work, right? So that's certainly also something that is nourishing the spirit and all three kind of, and certainly also the mind. And in my case, that resulted in an initiative that I posted a blog like in mid-March, and I suggested, well, so on the emerging learnings of the Corona crisis and how they relate to climate action. And so I suggested at the end of that very long blog an idea is that we should really create a global learning infrastructure right now where we together lean into the essence, right? Because whenever disruption hits, kind of there's a brief moment where you can clarify for yourself what truly is essential for you, right? So where we connect with our own essence, and from there reimagine our journey forward, both on an individual, organizational, but also on the level of our civilization, right? How to reimagine our economies, democracies, learning and media systems, and so forth. Within a few days, 10,000 people said, I want to be part of that. And within 12 days, this whole thing was created by a group of 100 volunteers organizing around 7 different language tracks. So this is now a journey called Gaia, Global Gaia as an acronym for Global Activation of Intention and Action. And it's like weekly practices that people, across the planet from all over the place, use. And then every other week we come together for global, Zoom sessions where we break out in small groups and continue that conversation. So it's, and during the first meeting, I remember one of the participants said, everything that I have experienced in my life has prepared me for this moment now. Everything that I have experienced in my life has prepared me for this moment now. And so disruption happens. Radical change is not only necessary, but also possible, and this is, so the time for this is now. So this kind of feeling and what this woman articulated with this phrase deeply resonated within myself. And that's certainly also nourishing me. That's nourishing my spirit, because I feel if I only make a small contribution towards accomplishing that, for example, with doing stuff like Gaia, that's whatever I do in that regard, even though I expend a lot of energy, the more energy I give, the more energy comes back. I think that's what's nourishing me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So what do you have to share with the leaders of the YMCA and all the young leaders around the world today about where we come from, where we are going?
Well, so I am, to some degree, I'm really not that familiar really with all the work of the YMCA, and I know little of that. So I want to respond to that question more indirectly by just sharing a little bit from my own context that I have seen, and maybe then leave it to you to do the transfer. What of that is applicable from your own situation. So to share a few of these experiences and images and insights. So this is, of course, what I was just talking about, which is the moment we live in, the moment of disruption, right? So, and if you picture ourselves here on the left-hand side, that's how most people on Earth, in my experience, feel about the current situation. And it's not only Corona, it actually started before, but it's much more dramatic now. So we are here. Disruption means the future here will be different from the past. And we know a lot about this, what's broken here. We know less about this, what's beginning to emerge, right? Or now, be it 2030 or be it maybe 2022, who knows? And we know least about how to move from here to there, this journey. And what I learned over the years is, in dealing with leaders, and I think my first message really would be, this kind of situation and Leslie talked about that, and Amina talked about that. This kind of situation is going to continue, right? So whatever happens in this century, we don't know, but we know one thing for sure: these types of disruptions will increase. So what we need to learn is, how do we respond to a situation like that? And what I learned, I did like focus on that, my research the past 20 years. I'm an action researcher here at MIT. And what I learned about that, the answer to that is twofold. It takes a journey that in part is an outer journey and in part is an inner journey that moves you through an inner process of letting go and letting come, and of sensing, going to the edges of the system. So that I think would be my first, my first point of what I have been learning. And the perspective that I'm speaking from is something that you all, I'm sure, have seen many times. It's a systems thinking based perspective. And all systems thinking, as you know, starts with this distinction here, right? With symptoms at the top versus, what you see above the waterline, right? Versus the deeper structural issues below the waterline, right? So, and structures and mental models, or paradigms of thought. So those are like the traditional things we see here. But I think what we have seen over the past few years is a third dimension of these root issues that I call source, and which have to do with the deeper sources of our identity, of our creativity, of who we are and who we want to become. So that's real deep change, transformational change, right? Needs to deal with all four of these levels. So that's all what I'm saying here. And I call this model awareness-based systems change, and it's based on these three, principles. You cannot understand a system unless you change it. It's the famous dictum by Kurt Lewin, kind of the founder of action research. Secondly, you cannot change a system unless you transform consciousness. So let me rephrase that. You cannot change a system truly, right, unless you address all four of these levels here, right? I could now go into the corona and spell that out, but we don't have so then that would be the only thing we talk about. So you can do that yourself. You know that from your own situation, right? So you cannot change a system unless you address all of these levels here, unless you transform consciousness, by which I mean transforming the mindsets. Because if you don't transform the mindsets, then the same people, if you just change, say, the structure and so forth, and systems, the same people will create the same problems that they have been creating in the old structure before, right? So real change needs to transform kind of this paradigm of thought, and also this deeper source level of, that I was mentioning before, which leads us to the third one, which is, so if that's true, right? You cannot change the system unless you transform consciousness. Then the question, of course, is how? So that's where the third one comes in. You cannot transform consciousness unless you make a system see and sense itself. Well, we know that from the interpersonal learning, right? Kind of from coaching. We know that from all kind of, we know that from all sorts of, therapy work and coaching and leadership work. But what I'm saying is it also applies onto the levels of the whole system, right? We need, on a systems level, we need methods and tools that allow us as a larger system to see and sense ourselves. Because why does that matter? Because when you look at the symptoms here, the results that we enact in almost all systems today, we collectively create results that nobody wants, right? Climate change, inequality. I mean, we heard that earlier in this session here. So the mental health, right, issues. So basically what I'm saying here, the SDGs that were referenced by Amina earlier and by Leslie, they, you can really group them into these three categories, right? So the first 10 are really around the social divide, right? The disconnect between self and other. The next 5 are around the environmental divide and all the issues related to that. But then the last 2 are really around the disconnect between self and nature. And then the last 2 really are, you could say that's kind of more around the deeper spiritual divide, by which I mean the disconnect between self and self, kind of our deeper sources, from which we have peace, justice, partnerships, right? How we work together, the deeper foundations based on which we build co-creative relationships. So, okay, disruption happens, that much we know. I mean, that's no news today. But what I would say is, what you can respond. So what does it mean now from a systems view to look at that? And it means something very simple that relates to how we respond to disruption every moment, kind of every day, but also you can see it on a societal level. Basically, there are 2 ways how we can, 3 ways really, how we can respond to disruption. One is this one here, downloading. We just keep doing the same thing, right? Same old, same old. That's less and less an option, we know that. So that's why the other 2 really matter. You can either turn away and close down, or you can turn toward and lean in. So turn away and close down, right, is really based on a freeze reaction of the mind, heart, and will, AKA ignorance, hate, and fear, right? Make America great again. So the most important word of that phrase is the last one. Again, it means you reorient yourself in the past, right? That's the freeze reaction of the mind, heart, will. And that's a lot what we see in the world. But we also see this, turning towards and leaning into an emerging future that we don't even know what it is, which only works if we activate these capacities, opening the mind, opening the heart, opening the will, AKA accessing our curiosity, compassion, and courage. That's, so Carlos, what do we need? It's very simple. We need this capacity. What's the problem today? Why do we see all of this stuff here? Because of 2 factors. 1, disruption happens, and 2, a lack of this deeper capacity. And if I am thrown into a situation of disruption and I operate in an environment where I could not in school, not in the other institutions, develop these deeper capacities, I am thrown into this space. We all know that because we all have been there. So that's basically the work, I would say, right? So this is kind of the work. We could go into more details. Again, we don't have really time for that. But I would say, doing this work, building these capacities here, that's kind of what brings us together, I think, in this call. Kind of that's where we all, hold our peace. But what I would say is that today, as we see so much amplification of this upper space, including through, surveillance capitalism and so forth, right? Yeah, so the role of social media and of technology, kind of, so there could be, I could give a whole talk about this, right? Half a day. But you can see that for yourself because there's a lot of amplification going on up here. The question is, can we amplify this space here? And I think what's called there, what are we called to do, has to do with innovations and infrastructures, not only on an organizational, but also on a societal level, in terms of new learning infrastructures, new democratic and governance infrastructures, and new economic infrastructures that, shift our economy from ego to eco, from organized, from revolving around an ego system awareness to one that's organized around an ecosystem awareness, by which I mean an awareness that is focusing on the well-being of all. So I want to talk about this first part here, kind of the new learning infrastructures, whole person, whole system, because I think that's the space you're in, and I'm also in, kind of, so that's, you know, but of course it relates to how to support these other two types of innovations and infrastructures. So let me just briefly explain to you what I mean with whole person and whole systems learning, right? Because, and if you only from this whole presentation remember one slide, this would be this would be my suggestion, kind of, because it's something very simple. It's talk about the whole person and the whole system, and it's one slide that summarizes what today is going on in the whole space of learning and leadership. And I think what's going on today is two things. We see, number one, deepening, right? A deepening of the learning process from head-centric technical learning, learning by listening, to reflective, which is head and hand, right? Learning by doing, to transformational learning, which requires us to bring in all three, head, heart, and hand, on the one hand. And the other thing we see is that we need to expand who is learning, from the individual to the team to the organization to the whole system. Now, what you see here is a matrix, right? And just ask yourself, okay, all the billions of dollars, the hundreds of billions of dollars that move into this space, right, across all societal institutions, where's all the money going in this matrix? And the answer, of course, is in the bottom left. And where to address the problems that Leslie and Amina talked about, where do they need to go? And the answer, of course, is in the top right. That's the problem. That's the shift. What is shifting? This, a focus where we build institutions, right, around this space here, to one that's looking at the entire matrix, right? And that's particularly looking at transformational learning infrastructures, not only on the level of the individual or team, but also on the level of the whole system. Now, that's basically the shift that I see going on, and where I try, you know, and where I think we are in the process of developing prototypes and, you know, and demonstrating how this can go to scale. So I want to close with like a systems view on a few spaces that I'm sure many of you are, you know, already connected with a number of your projects. And one way to think about systems change is something very simple. Kind of, you use this, right? Kind of our smartphones, right? So what do we do with the smartphone? Well, once in a while, we upgrade the operating system, right? And the same, I believe, needs to happen on the level of systems change. And what I find so interesting is that we see the same operating systems applicable across all systems. So we see an evolution from input and authority-centric to output and efficiency-centric 2.0 to 3.0 outcome and user-centric to 4.0, something that's beginning now. So if you look at health and learning, so that's the past, right? Traditional doctor and teacher-centric structures. Today we live in the world of 2.0, evidence-based medicine, output and efficiency focus, right? Or teaching for testing, right? Also known as bulimia learning, fast in, fast out. So not real learning, which brings us to 3.0, learner-centric infrastructures, right? The good school or the good healthcare system, right? Patient-centric. Is that the future? I don't think so. The future will move towards resilience, right? From dealing with symptoms of pathology towards strengthening sources of health and well-being. And we'll move from old type of curricula to activating the deep learning cycle that I was mentioning before. When you look at food and farm, we move from industrial monoculture, right? Well, all, so which is the mother of most of our environmental problems, to organic agriculture and food, that's better because it's reducing the negative footprint. Is it good enough? I don't think so. I think where we are moving into is food as medium for healing planet and people, right? And we see that Corona is actually a massive shift, can be a massive shift into that direction, kind of strengthening our, hyper-localizing our food cycles. Corporate, sustainability and CSR, from efficiency practices to innovation to mission-driven enterprises. When you look into finance, Leslie was talking a little bit about that, from extractive capital, aka Wall Street, externality blind, to impact investing, externality aware. That's better, but is it truly transformative? In many cases, not. So really focusing on systems transformation is the type of funding that's so much in need today. And all of that is, of course, embedded in the evolution of governance, right? The evolution of our larger governance system from, centralized and, the visible hand to the invisible hand of the market, and then complementing that with organized interest groups and lobbying. And now we see a shift to a fourth coordination mechanism that I call ABC, awareness-based collective action, which has to do with all the stakeholders coming together and bringing more intentionality into how we direct resources, how we direct economic resources, like, for example, our money, towards the well-being of all. So in summary, what is it we try to do? Planetary healing and civilizational renewal. The only way to make that work, I believe, is by activating generative social fields. That's the 4.0 shift, right? Kind of moving to this fourth level, this operating, the co-creative ecosystem way of operating. But what we see is that this cannot happen without building these new capacities, this kind of transformation literacy. And that's, I think, the missing, we need enabling infrastructures. That's what I meant with, whole person, whole systems infrastructures for learning. And that's, I believe, kind of where, youth needs to be put into the driver's seat of change. And what I'm working towards is to really democratize the access to transformation literacy by creating such a school for transformation that is based on integrating science, consciousness, social arts, and social technologies with, and in the context of profound social change, in order to support all these great initiatives that are already underway, but that often lack like an enabling infrastructures towards kind of this shift of a more ecosystemic way of operating.
Thank you so much. I think this needs that we internalize, because there's a lot of information through your presentation. So to give ourselves to make it sink a little bit, we're going to take a small break to see something our YMCA are doing around the world, while we give the time to our participants to ask the question. There are already some questions, but I want to observe this and take time to internalize so that we can come with the question, not just for Otto, but also to Leslie. And then the Deputy Secretary General also promised that if there's a question for her, we will send her all those questions. So you can still ask a question for Amina Mohammed. So thank you again. So let's take this break, and then maybe your question come.
Right now, many of us are experiencing tough times. Here at the Y, we've adapted to continue to support young people and local communities. as we have done for over 100 years. Some of our doors might not be open, but right now, across Australia, Ys are evolving to meet local needs, such as delivering support to vulnerable young people online instead of face-to-face, handing out food packs to those in need, and continuing to provide essential childcare for families. We're connecting online with fitness challenges and hosting live streaming activities. And with the voices of young people never more critical, we're amplifying them through our youth online platform Why Not and our podcast Why Chats. You see, it's who we are. It's what we do. We believe in the power of inspired young people. That's why we're the largest and oldest youth movement in the world, operating in over 120 countries. We'll continue to create positive change and social impact across Australia despite the challenges. And when this crisis is over, the Y will still be here to support young people and the communities that support them.
This is from Australia. I would like to use this opportunity to congratulate the YMCA of Victoria. They successfully managed to get an important grant from the government to continue their work. I know many YMCA around the world are talking to the partner, the government, to make sure that the important work of the YMCA continue in the community. So welcome back. So we have Leslie and Otto. Please, when you ask your question, you can direct directly to any of them. Make sure that you know who you want to ask the question to. So what I have now, I have a question for Otto, and then other question for Leslie. So Otto, one of the question is, does transformational system change require participants to give up some of the power and control? If so, how can we enable traditional power broker to change?
The short answer is yes. You saw that, if you remember the second last slide, kind of the matrix, right? The move to 4.0. In terms of governance, it's moving from very centralized structures to decentralized, to network, to ecosystems. And as we evolve our governance systems, it means that yes, the power holders in the old system, they need to learn that they can effect more, they can accomplish more when they let go some of their power, because more possibility becomes available then. That's a very important shift. And I already, Gandhi said that the enemy that we fight is not the other person, it's the old structure. So when you fight an old structure, you need to imagine and find new roles for the existing power holders, and also provide help, right? Help to that, in fact, when you move through this letting go of some of the traditional power resources, new possibilities open up for you. But they only open up when you first let go of the old stuff. So it's kind of this letting go, letting come dynamic, which is really key. And in my experience, to make that happen on both sides, let's say, of a conflict situations, you need support on either side. And that's kind of this support and learning infrastructure. That's what I mean with the top right of the matrix, kind of learning infrastructures on the level of the entire ecosystem that will provide these safe spaces for leaders to go and coach each other going through this process.
Thank you. Thank you. A question to Leslie is, what do you think the YMCA need to prepare for the after COVID so that YMCA remain relevant using the available philanthropic sources? What do you think the YMCA need to do differently?
Well, I think as the cartoon showed, we are just at the cusp of a much bigger and transformational crisis. And I think that it's critical that the YMCAs worldwide have a view on what they can do in the communities and youth to mitigate the climate crisis that's there, and to support the building and strengthening of coalitions and movements to bring more people along. I mean, ultimately, we do face a bit of a narrative issue because I think that the problem is so big and so existential. We just all shut down as individuals and stick our head in the sand. And there is, I think, an urgent need to, help people be aware and activate them. And YMCAs, with your reach, with your youth ambassadors, I actually think that you're very well positioned to play a critical role there.
Thank you. Another question to Otto is, you talk a lot about the individual shift. What about the organizational shift? How can an organization become a transformational organization, and how can that be applied to the YMCA?
Yeah, I mean, that's very critical. And I think that's actually the main focus of my work, because I think systems change does require individual change, but that's necessary. It's not sufficient, right? And just as on an individual level, I think to go to a profound, through profound behavioral change, which is what we are talking about, you can't do it alone, right? You need the other, right? You need a group, you need a face-to-face, you need at least one other person that's holding you. We need a holding space, right? So that's where the real transformation happens. We know that from many face-to-face level profound changes. And the same, of course, is applicable to organizations. So that means an organization can go through profound transformation and change not alone. You need an ecosystem. So that's why the ecosystem matters. The ecosystem is really kind of the set of partners for an organization. And in most jobs we have, so most leadership jobs today, to be successful in your job, you need to change the behavior of other people that are outside of your own organizations. That's true for most of us, right? So how do you do that? Well, through the quality of relationships. Well, how do you improve that? Through the quality of your listening. It's kind of these kinds of things. I think kind of the ecosystem leadership challenge is universal today. And one of the things that, we know exactly what needs to happen, right? For all the, you can, including climate, right? You go to a project drawdown and so on. We know exactly the 80 solutions, everything. Why is it not happening? Why do we have this knowing doing gap? Because there is, a missing capacity to activate this co-creative leadership space on the whole systems level, on an ecosystem level. And that's so hard. So try to get, I find there's no problem in funding any kind of project, really. But if you really want to invest, the most important investments today would be building that deeper leadership capacity. It's almost impossible to get anything for that. Because people don't understand that this is kind of on that deeper structural level, that is kind of what's holding us back. So this building this deeper capacity, or building this transformation literacy kind of at the level of scale that's necessary today, which is the scale of the whole system, I think that's the big leverage point today.
Well, thanks. The challenge this is posing to us as a YMCA, one of what we do best is the leadership, building the leadership capacity of young people, leadership capacity of community leaders. So the question is, are we doing the right things? Are we at 1.023? Definitely not 4.0 from what your matches you show. So it's important that how do we transition from where we are to something that when we are empowering young people, we help to reboot currently what is happening to make sure that the result of our problem is truly transformative, not at the surface only. That's the challenge your presentation is giving to us now.
Yes, and I would say I completely agree. And so the two, so where to pay attention to. So usually this kind of deeper transformational change, and we know that from all big system studies, right? Where does the change in systems come from? Well, not from the center, right? It comes from the periphery. So you want to go to the edges of the system because that's where you see the new happening first, right? And most clearly. So that would be one suggestion, right? Go to the edges, kind of lean into those areas of your system, around the edges of your system, where this new way of operating may be already happening, right? And make that more visible. So that's one. And the other one is, yes, everyone knows kind of for this ecosystemic way of operating, we need platforms and so on. Everyone knows that. But what is less attended to is that these platforms and all these nice things, digital things, only work if you create a container, right? If you create like a holding space, kind of, that's kind of the social, mental. So if you create like a holding space, the container is facilitator speak for the set of, for a holding space that allows you in a particular stakeholder groups, which will bring together people with very different interests, to drop to a deeper level of connection and co-creativity. That's really what the leadership work is, right? Kind of to creating these containers, bringing in kind of the stakeholders that need each other to change the system. So that's an ecosystem, right? So the ecosystem of stakeholders is people who need each other to change the system, and then creating an environment for them to make progress, right? And to access their deeper sources of creativity. And that's what I find inspiring, is that, you know, a lot of that takes place locally. Kind of, that's kind of where you can have a great starting point. Leslie also made reference to that. And then, of course, we need to aggregate, we need to connect all these, and you need to kind of bring this new way of operating also to the higher levels of systems. But we have examples there too. I think kind of the whole Paris Agreement process is an example of that, where as a global community, we rise to the occasion. The whole response to Corona is an example of that, where as a global community, we rise to the occasion. We are bending the curve. We are focusing as a global community on one topic, right? And align our attention with our intention. And so the moment we do that, we can flatten the curve. We can bend the curve. And we can apply the same decisiveness and the same intentionality of really transforming our collective behavior, transforming our systems, also to climate action and some of the other key challenges that we talked about. I think that's the learning that we all have been learning over the past few weeks. Everyone knows that. Now, are we going to use that?
Thank you. Question to you, Leslie. By the way, one of the participants, not in the question in the chat, was impressed that you are one of the younger CEO of a foundation he ever done. So he was very impressed about that and wanted to know how many young people you have in your foundation.
Is 50 young?
So, but the question to you is, one theme that came out in this talk is about the young people need to lead. How will you recommend or see this happen? Much of the young people are burdened with student debt and lack of capital for starting organization. So how might existing company support or allow young people to lead with existing structure?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think I can answer that in the context of the work that we do, which is quite a narrow lens. But I think that, first and foremost, in everything we fund as a foundation, it's critical that we bring in diversity of opinions, and that includes having a diversity on boards of our partners that includes young people and old people. And I consider myself in that last bucket, older person. But I think that there's not enough being done in the corporate world and industry to bring young people into decision making. And that's just, of course, a function of one's age and experience. But I think more does need to be done. And I think as you know, we as a foundation try to have gender equity and inclusion as part of everything that we fund that includes age in that, and that's an important element. But I think also what's really important is it's sometimes very difficult for young people to have a voice. And again, we work through industry, so I'm going to answer this from more of an industry perspective. And what we see happening, if you look at kind of worker voice, which tends to be, you know, more young people when you're looking at workers in places like Bangladesh and India, where, you know, the average age is in the 20s. Worker voice is very weak. And why is that? Well, the ability to collectively bargain, you know, the ability to have functioning unions isn't quite there. And I do think as society, we need to do more to preserve labor rights and to enable workers to know their rights and be able to negotiate for those rights. So a lot of work that we're funding as a foundation is looking at how do you actually secure labor rights and ensure workers can step up and be part of that discussion. I do think more foundations need to play in that space. Of course, there's a lot of great foundations doing that. Ford Foundation, OSF, Rockefeller, many that have been active in the space for a long time, but we need more because labor rights are being eroded, and that erodes the voice largely of the youth in these industries. So that's how we're looking at it. But again, it's a very narrow lens because of our focus areas.
Thank you very much. We are coming to the end of our talk today. Again, I want to say thank you. If I want to remember one central word that everybody uses about system change. And we understand how systems change, and we also need to identify what is happening. And Leslie, through your presentation, we can see this is a new foundation that is focusing on where the focus needs to be. So we need to go deeper and to understand ourselves. What are our motivation? How we become this container Otto was talking about for the system change. I have a few announcements before we close. To announce the next week's speaker. We are pleased to have Mark Federley, the CEO of Forbes, who will be one of our speakers next week, together with Christine Tim. She's the global startup ecosystem and Forbes under 30. She work. She's a good friend of the YMCA. We have also Claudia Aparicio. She's the co-founder of Growth X and managing partner of Singularity University from Colombia. And then we'll receive a video from Donald Caraboca. He's the chair of the Global Fund and also African Union Special Envoy on COVID-19. And finally, we'll have Peter Nassi, the National General Secretary or the CEO of the East Jerusalem YMCA. These are the speakers for next week. And I want to also use this opportunity to thank all the participants. This is the 5th talk, and you are coming every Thursday. We want to thank you. Some of your suggestion is, can we publish the lesson learned through this time? So we say, yes, we can do that. So we are planning to do a publication, a playbook, whatever we want to call it, that will include all the activity or the major activity YMCA have been doing to respond to the COVID, but also what are our learning, what have we been learning, and also acknowledge that we have our blind spot. There are many things we cannot see. So we will collect all those information. Already a group of our colleagues are listening to all the presentation and will come with the lesson. But we want to invite you for a survey. I know we are all overwhelmed by survey, but I want to please, we're going to send you this survey to share with you what have been your learning. And out of those learning, we're going to design the way forward this talk. So from tomorrow, we'll send you a link to this survey. I will really want to invite you to respond to this survey to help us to gather all those learning. So once again, Leslie, thank you very much. There is a question I didn't have the opportunity or courage to ask, that people are asking, how do we become your partner? You did not answer, you didn't receive that question, but how YMCA become your partner?
Oh, do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Well, the good news is I'm very close to one of your esteemed colleagues, CJ, who is you know, very much behind this initiative. So let's talk. We'll take that offline.
Thank you. And Otto, we aspire to be this container, and I think we'll come back to you to see how do we take this learning out of this. But all of that, thank you to all of you. I will just hand over to Madam President to just the concluding word, and that's it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Otto, I want to live in quadrant 4.0, and we'll do everything we can to try to move ourselves there. And Leslie, your pledge, the philanthropic pledge, is brilliant, and I'm hoping that some of those principles will carry forward in our post-pandemic phase. So thank you very much to our great speakers. Thank you, Carlos, for moderating. Thank you again to the Deputy Secretary General for sharing that precious time with us. And thank you to the participants for being with us again. And finally, I just wrote in the chat line, thank you to the staff. It is the staff that put this all together for us, and we really appreciate it. So thanks for all your hard work. Thank you.
And thank you to Renata and Nagako, who have been translating in Spanish and in Japanese. Dear friend, thank you very much, and see you next Thursday. Peace be with you.
And with you.
Yeah, thank you.